Her earliest years were shaped by the harsh realities of enslavement, yet even as a child, there was a spark of awareness in her eyes. She observed the rhythms of the plantation, noting the routines of the overseers, the patterns of her fellow enslaved, and the subtle hierarchies that governed daily life. Each interaction, each task, each punishment left an impression, teaching her not just survival but the intricacies of power, control, and opportunity. She learned to move with caution, to listen beyond words, and to interpret the hidden meanings behind glances and gestures. Family and community were both sources of support and of early lessons in resilience. Elders passed down knowledge of survival, strategies for discretion, and stories of resistance that had long been whispered through generations. She absorbed these lessons, internalizing a deep understanding of human behavior and the ways in which intelligence and cunning could exist even under extreme oppression. Bonds with siblings, cousins, and neighbors became avenues for learning, for subtle collaboration, and for the small acts of agency that could ease daily burdens or protect one another from harm. Her childhood also revealed the cruelty and unpredictability of those in authority. She witnessed the swift enforcement of discipline, the arbitrary exercise of power, and the way fear was used to maintain order. Yet alongside this brutality, she recognized opportunities, moments where oversight was lax, where routines could be subtly manipulated, and where careful observation could reveal patterns in authority. These early experiences planted the seeds of strategic thinking, teaching her that intelligence and awareness could be tools of quiet defiance. By her early adolescence, she had developed a keen understanding of the dynamics around her. Every task, every interaction, and every observation contributed to a growing sense of agency, a recognition that even within the constraints imposed by enslavement, subtle resistance and strategic action were possible. These formative years laid the foundation for the remarkable acts of defiance and influence that would come to define her life. The first unmistakable stirrings of defiance emerged quietly, almost imperceptibly, within the rhythms of plantation life. She moved among the fields, her hands skilled in labor yet her mind constantly calculating, observing every nuance of behavior, every opportunity to challenge authority without immediately drawing its full wrath. It began with small, deliberate actions that might have seemed accidental to the unobservant eye, a tool left slightly misaligned, a bundle of produce subtly damaged, or a small portion hidden away for the hungry. Each act was intentional, precise, and aimed at undermining the unquestioned power of the masters while simultaneously maintaining plausible deniability. She understood that true defiance required strategy, patience, and psychological insight. The smallest gestures could ignite fear when observed in context. She would allow herself to be watched, to appear compliant while secretly orchestrating minor disruptions that created a growing sense of unease among the overseers. The tension became palpable. A master would notice a missing item and tighten his scrutiny, only to find more subtle acts of resistance in the days that followed. These carefully orchestrated sequences established a pattern, a quiet war in which perception was as significant as action. Her intelligence was apparent not only in her acts of defiance but in the way she influenced those around her. She communicated through subtle signals, a glance, a hand motion, or a whispered word, creating a network of understanding that allowed others to participate in minor acts of resistance. Men and women who had long endured the brutality of slavery began to see that resistance, even in small forms, was possible. The ripple effect spread silently, the morale of the enslaved improved while the master's confidence eroded. Fear was no longer a one-sided tool, it had become a currency she could manipulate. Rumors began to circulate within the quarters. Whispers of her cleverness and audacity traveled from cabin to cabin. She knows when they watch, one would say, and yet she does what she wills. Children listened with wide-eyed fascination, absorbing the stories of a woman who dared to bend the strictures of their world. The narrative of her defiance became a legend even before it could be fully documented, shaping the psychology of both the oppressed and the oppressors. Each subtle success emboldened her, each minor misstep learned from, until a rhythm of rebellion was established, one that was imperceptible to most yet undeniable in its effects. The plantation owners began to notice the growing pattern. At first, they dismissed the small disturbances as coincidence, attributing them to carelessness or chance. But as days turned into weeks, the consistency and intelligence behind the acts became apparent. A tool intentionally misplaced, livestock released under cover of darkness, secret gatherings detected only by fleeting shadows, all pointed toward a mind at work, a mind that understood not only the physical but the psychological landscape of the plantation. Fear and uncertainty crept into the hearts of the masters, destabilizing a system they had long believed invulnerable. Her approach to rebellion was neither reckless nor overtly confrontational, it was precise and disciplined. She carefully selected moments when her actions would have maximum effect with minimum immediate risk. A loaf of bread gone missing at the exact time an overseer entered the kitchen alone, or a strategically broken plow that delayed work, created anxiety and confusion. These acts, while minor in isolation, collectively demonstrated a capacity for strategy that unsettled the plantation hierarchy. Her ability to anticipate reactions, to predict where suspicion would fall, and to redirect attention away from herself, reflected a tactical mind honed by observation and necessity. Psychological tension became the central battleground. The overseers, accustomed to unquestioned obedience, began doubting their own perceptions. They watched and rewatched scenes in their minds, trying to pinpoint how and when she executed her acts. Meanwhile, she remained a step ahead, learning from each reaction, refining her methods, and maintaining an air of calm that belied the danger she courted. The uncertainty she created was powerful, masters feared her audacity, while the enslaved found hope in her example, a quiet promise that resistance was possible. The first coordinated act of defiance involved not just sabotage, but subtle coordination among a small group of trusted individuals. Through whispered instructions and signals, she orchestrated the release of animals into the fields, delaying work and causing a ripple of frustration that reached the highest levels of the estate. The overseers, frustrated and humiliated, attempted to punish the responsible parties, yet the careful planning ensured no evidence could directly implicate her. Her ability to manipulate both action and perception became increasingly apparent, and her legend grew with each successful maneuver. As her influence expanded, she began teaching others to act with discretion, to understand the rhythms of surveillance, and to anticipate authority. Small lessons in observation, timing, and subtlety became part of daily life, transforming ordinary acts into coordinated resistance. The enslaved began to understand that even seemingly insignificant choices, the direction of a glance, the timing of a step, could carry meaning. This education in quiet rebellion empowered them, reshaping the social dynamics of the plantation without ever provoking immediate retaliation. Her ingenuity extended beyond physical acts. She understood human psychology, exploiting greed, fear, and assumptions to her advantage. Overseers were distracted by minor disturbances, their suspicion deflected, while she quietly continued her interventions. Masters believed they were maintaining control, unaware that every punishment or investigation strengthened her position by teaching her the limits of their authority. Each calculated misstep by the masters became an opportunity for her to deepen influence, create doubt, and further unsettle the plantation's rigid structure. Rumors beyond the plantation began to form. Neighboring estates whispered of a woman who outsmarted overseers, who manipulated events with skill and cunning. Some tales exaggerated her actions, imagining near mythical feats of intelligence and courage. Yet even the grounded accounts emphasized her brilliance, her audacity, and her ability to act decisively within an environment designed to suppress initiative. The reputation she was building served as a psychological weapon, creating fear that extended beyond the physical boundaries of the plantation itself. The woman's defiance was not only strategic but also deeply personal. Each act challenged the moral assumptions imposed by slavery, each minor victory reclaimed a measure of autonomy denied by the system. Her intelligence, courage, and foresight became tools for survival and resistance. Through her actions, she demonstrated that even within the rigid constraints of oppression, agency could be carved, hope could flourish, and fear could be redirected. She maintained a delicate balance, understanding that a single overt act of rebellion could provoke deadly retaliation. Her defiance relied on timing, observation, and psychological manipulation, allowing her to act boldly while minimizing immediate risk. Every gesture was measured, every decision deliberate, and every outcome studied for lessons that would inform future actions. This discipline was as essential as courage, enabling her to navigate the constant danger with skill and resilience. The plantation itself became a stage for her unfolding strategy. Shadows, paths, and hidden spaces were as critical as the actions themselves. She exploited every feature of the environment, from dense thickets that concealed meetings to the predictable patrol routes of the overseers. Each act of sabotage or subtle resistance was designed not only to create immediate effect but to teach lessons in observation, timing, and strategic thinking to those who followed her lead. The landscape became a participant in the rebellion, shaping and being shaped by her actions. Her growing influence transformed the social dynamics of the enslaved community. Trust, loyalty, and discretion became vital commodities. Those who aligned with her found themselves empowered, participating in a subtle, almost invisible network of resistance. Relationships within the quarters shifted as respect for her acumen and courage spread. Fear of punishment remained, but it was now tempered by admiration and a renewed sense of possibility. Her example demonstrated that resistance could be intelligent, disciplined, and effective. The escalation of her defiance created a psychological tension that permeated every corner of the plantation. Masters grew increasingly anxious, sensing an intelligence they could not control. Overseers doubted their own perceptions, unsure if mistakes were mere chance or part of a larger plan. Meanwhile, the enslaved watched, learned, and slowly began to act with greater subtlety and coordination. The interplay of fear, respect, and admiration created a charged atmosphere, a tension that would only intensify in the coming weeks and months. The spark of rebellion was not a single event but a process, a series of deliberate, intelligent acts that challenged authority and reshaped perception. Through patience, observation, and strategic audacity, she transformed small, seemingly inconsequential acts into a growing legend that unsettled the masters and inspired those they sought to control. Each minor success reinforced the psychological battlefield, establishing her as a figure whose intelligence and courage commanded attention, fear, and respect in equal measure. By the end of this period, the plantation had shifted imperceptibly but fundamentally. The balance of power, though still heavily weighted toward the masters, was no longer absolute. The woman had created spaces for autonomy, moments of resistance, and a network of influence that operated quietly but effectively. Fear, once one-sided, had become a tool she wielded with precision. The stage was set for more daring acts, larger interventions, and confrontations that would test the limits of her intelligence, courage, and strategic skill. The overseers began noticing her movements long before they fully understood the implications of her actions. At first, it was subtle, a delayed response to a command, a glance that lingered too long, or a task completed with a precision that seemed almost too intentional. These small behaviors unsettled them, though they could not pinpoint why. Her presence carried a weight that shifted the atmosphere of the plantation. Men who had spent years enforcing obedience suddenly felt a gnawing uncertainty when she was near, as if their authority could be undone by mere observation. Every action she took was calculated, every step a part of a larger strategy designed to manipulate perception and test boundaries without inviting immediate retaliation. She was not alone in the quarters. Other enslaved individuals watched her with a mixture of admiration and fear, recognizing both the brilliance of her mind and the danger inherent in associating with someone so daring. Conversations in hushed tones circulated through the cabins, recounting her latest subtle acts of defiance and speculating on the next. Some whispered about her intelligence, others about the audacity she displayed, and a few spoke openly of fear that one misstep could bring swift punishment. The woman understood these dynamics, and she navigated them carefully, balancing influence with discretion, trust with caution. The overseers' unease grew as they attempted to assert control. Each time they thought they had caught her in a misdeed, they discovered only traces, hints, and subtle manipulations that left them questioning their own judgment. They implemented stricter patrols, monitored conversations more closely, and attempted to isolate individuals they suspected of aiding her, yet these measures often backfired. Her foresight allowed her to anticipate movements, avoid detection, and even exploit the heightened tension for strategic advantage. The plantation became a theater of psychological warfare, where perception was as crucial as action, and every minor victory reinforced her growing legend. Her influence extended beyond mere acts of sabotage. She had an acute understanding of human behavior, both enslaved and free, and she leveraged this to manipulate interactions to her benefit. A glance, a subtle gesture, a timely question could unsettle overseers, misdirect suspicion, or inspire collaboration among the enslaved. Every encounter became a test of observation and judgment, a chess game played across the fields, quarters, and hallways of the estate. The men and women who aligned with her began to act in concert, their behaviors synchronized through subtle cues and unspoken understandings. This growing network allowed her to extend influence while maintaining plausible deniability, ensuring that the masters could not easily suppress her activities. Fear and respect intertwined, creating a charged atmosphere. Overseers found themselves hesitant, second-guessing instructions, questioning the loyalty of their charges, and growing wary of being outmaneuvered by someone they considered inferior. The enslaved, meanwhile, drew inspiration from her example, their own sense of agency increasing in quiet but meaningful ways. Each subtle success reinforced the psychological tension, and the plantation's social order began to bend imperceptibly under the pressure of her calculated defiance. Her methods were diverse. She would sabotage tools in a way that delayed work without immediately revealing the culprit. She would misplace livestock just enough to create disruption but not enough to invite immediate reprisal. She orchestrated small acts of coordination among trusted individuals, teaching them how to communicate subtly, how to observe without being seen, and how to act in ways that maximized impact while minimizing risk. Each action served a dual purpose: immediate effect and long-term psychological conditioning, training both her allies and her adversaries to operate within the parameters she defined. Observation became central to her strategy. She watched the patterns of oversight, the routines of patrols, the habits of masters, and the vulnerabilities of those tasked with enforcing control. By understanding these rhythms, she could predict reactions, plan disruptions, and manipulate outcomes. The overseers, in contrast, struggled to comprehend how a single individual could remain consistently one step ahead. Their frustration intensified their vigilance, yet their heightened scrutiny only played into her hands, allowing her to refine her methods and expand her influence across the plantation. Communication among the enslaved had become sophisticated under her guidance. Coded words, subtle gestures, and timing-based signals allowed coordination that was nearly invisible to the masters. Messages traveled along well-established routes, using everyday tasks as cover. Even the youngest children became part of this network, observing patterns and passing along information without fully understanding its significance. The woman's ability to harness these networks made her presence felt far beyond her immediate location, transforming her from a single agent of defiance into a central node of influence across the plantation community. Over time, her reputation reached the neighboring estates. Tales of her cleverness and daring spread, carried by travelers, market interactions, and visiting workers. Some accounts exaggerated her abilities, casting her in near-mythical terms, while others focused on the tangible impacts of her actions: delayed work, mismanaged crops, and unsettled overseers. Both sets of stories reinforced her influence. Masters at nearby plantations grew cautious, aware that an intelligent, determined individual could destabilize their operations as well. Fear extended beyond physical boundaries, reaching into the minds of those who relied on unquestioned compliance to maintain authority. The psychological impact of her defiance cannot be overstated. Masters and overseers found themselves questioning their assumptions, doubting their own competence, and fearing the unpredictability of her actions. The enslaved, conversely, felt the stirrings of possibility, a reminder that resistance, though dangerous, was achievable. She had turned observation, subtle action, and the careful manipulation of perception into powerful tools. Her ability to navigate and influence human behavior, both individually and collectively, was unparalleled, creating an environment where fear, uncertainty, and admiration coexisted in tension. Her subtle acts of defiance often involved exploiting the weaknesses of authority figures. Overseers were distracted by minor disturbances, misled by deliberate false trails, and frustrated by patterns they could not decipher. The woman understood the predictable nature of human behavior: anger, impatience, overconfidence, and the desire for control could be manipulated to serve her objectives. Each interaction, each small misstep by her adversaries, became an opportunity to reinforce her position, expand her network, and continue the slow, deliberate process of undermining the plantation hierarchy. Even the physical landscape played a role in her strategy. She knew the hidden paths, the thickets that offered cover, and the vantage points that allowed surveillance without detection. These locations became essential to her ability to act, communicate, and evade capture. By mastering her environment, she added another layer of complexity to her defiance. The plantation itself became a participant in her strategy, the land bending to her understanding of space, concealment, and movement. Her network of observation and influence also created loyalty among those who trusted her judgment. Individuals who had previously acted only out of self-preservation began to participate in coordinated efforts, guided by her intelligence and discretion. Fear was tempered by the understanding that action could be both deliberate and safe when executed carefully. Each success reinforced the lessons of subtlety, timing, and psychological manipulation, creating a community capable of quiet but effective resistance. The growing tension culminated in moments where her actions could have provoked open confrontation, yet she managed to avoid detection and retaliation. By manipulating perception, diverting attention, and exploiting predictable human reactions, she continued to escalate the psychological game without directly risking her life. Her ability to remain calm, precise, and deliberate in these moments only added to her growing legend among both the enslaved and the masters. By the end of this period, the plantation had become a complex stage of observation, subtle manipulation, and strategic action. Her intelligence, patience, and understanding of human behavior had created a system in which her influence extended far beyond her immediate presence. Overseers and masters alike were unsettled, the enslaved inspired, and the network of coordination and subtle defiance had become a force to be reckoned with. Fear, respect, and anticipation intertwined, and the story of her defiance continued to grow, setting the stage for events that would push both her and the plantation to their limits. The whispers began quietly, slipping through the quarters like a faint wind before a storm, gathering substance as they traveled. Her acts of defiance, small yet deliberate, had already begun to unsettle the overseers, delay work, and inspire her peers. But it was in the retelling of these acts that her reputation truly grew. Every whispered story, every hushed conversation carried the seeds of legend, blending fact with speculation in a way that heightened fear and fascination alike. What had started as a collection of subtle sabotages and minor disruptions now became a narrative that transcended the boundaries of the plantation itself. The enslaved shared stories of her cleverness, recounting the precision with which she moved through the fields, the ingenuity behind her interventions, and the audacity with which she challenged authority, all while evading detection. Even as the stories spread, there was a deliberate care in their telling. Names were omitted, locations disguised, and events exaggerated just enough to avoid reprisal while still conveying the essential truth of her daring. Children listened wide-eyed, absorbing the narrative like a lesson in courage and cunning. Adults exchanged glances, the weight of fear mixed with admiration, and the knowledge that her influence was reshaping the rhythms of life on the plantation. Rumors became tools themselves, creating uncertainty among the overseers who were left to interpret fragmented accounts, unsure which details were true and which were hyperbolic. This ambiguity worked to her advantage, a psychological weapon that required no direct action beyond the initial acts themselves. The shadows of the plantation at night were alive with possibility. By the time darkness fell, her movements had become almost invisible yet profoundly felt. She slipped through hidden paths, gathering information, passing messages, and observing both the enslaved and the masters. Her presence became a source of tension and speculation, the unseen nature of her actions amplified their impact. No one could claim with certainty where she was or what she intended, and this uncertainty fueled fear. Masters and overseers found themselves constantly vigilant, yet the very vigilance they practiced became a vulnerability she could exploit. The plantation became a theater of suspense, with her as both the unseen conductor and the central actor in a quiet, dangerous drama. Within the quarters, discussions of her deeds took on a life of their own. A jar of stolen provisions might become a tale of near-legendary cunning, a misaligned tool became evidence of strategic sabotage. The retellings were not merely entertainment, they were instruction. Each story contained subtle lessons about observation, timing, and subversion, guiding those who would follow her lead without exposing themselves to unnecessary risk. Children and adults alike learned the rhythms of defiance, internalizing techniques of concealment and coordination that would serve the community long after any single act had passed. Masters, meanwhile, struggled with the intangible nature of her influence. They could see only fragments, the disruptions that interrupted productivity, the mismanaged tools, the missing livestock. They were aware of a growing reputation that preceded her, stories that suggested a level of intelligence and audacity they could not easily confront. Each rumor, each whispered account, became a source of psychological unease, forcing them to question the reliability of both their observations and their authority. Their fear was compounded by the uncertainty, they could not punish what they could not fully prove, and every investigation seemed to lead only to more questions rather than answers. The psychological complexity of this phase of her rebellion was profound. She understood the power of perception, the way rumors could travel faster and further than any physical act. By allowing stories to circulate, she magnified her influence exponentially. Each narrative reinforced her reputation, creating a sense of omnipresence that extended beyond the plantation itself. She was no longer merely a participant in daily life, she had become a symbol, a figure whose actions inspired fear, respect, and careful admiration. She also learned to manipulate the storytellers themselves. By offering small glimpses of her activities, an overlooked act of cleverness, a subtle display of skill, she encouraged retellings that exaggerated her abilities and shaped perceptions. Each story carried with it the dual purpose of informing and intimidating, instructing the enslaved in techniques of subtle rebellion while unsettling the overseers. The act of storytelling became an extension of her strategy, a way to continue her influence without taking physical risks. As her legend grew, even those on neighboring plantations began to hear fragments of the story. Traders, visitors, and laborers carried accounts of her cleverness and courage into surrounding communities, where they were further embellished and mythologized. Some tales described her as nearly untouchable, moving through the night with stealth and cunning that defied belief. Others focused on the tangible disruptions she had caused, emphasizing the fear she inspired among the overseers. This spread of reputation created a broader psychological impact, extending her influence far beyond her immediate environment. Her mastery of psychological warfare was evident in the way she used uncertainty as a tool. Overseers, frustrated by the incomplete information, became hypervigilant, second-guessing their decisions and questioning the loyalty of those around them. Fear became self-perpetuating. The more they sought to control, the more they were manipulated, and each reaction fed into her growing understanding of human behavior. This cycle of observation, action, and response allowed her to continue her acts of defiance with increasing sophistication, always a step ahead of those who sought to suppress her. Within the enslaved community, the effect of her actions and the circulating stories was transformative. Individuals who had previously acted in isolation began to recognize patterns, learning to coordinate through subtle signals and unspoken agreements. Confidence grew, tempered by caution, as people began to test the boundaries of control, inspired by the example of someone who had already navigated the dangers of rebellion with remarkable skill. Each successful act, however minor, reinforced the collective belief that resistance was possible, creating a network of influence that strengthened over time. Her awareness of the dual nature of rumor allowed her to shape not just perception, but behavior. She encouraged certain stories to spread, guiding attention toward specific events while leaving other acts unnoticed. This manipulation created a sense of unpredictability that kept overseers on edge, uncertain which disruptions were imminent and where they might occur. The controlled chaos became a strategic advantage, turning the fear of potential action into a weapon against those in positions of authority. Nighttime continued to be her ally. The cover of darkness allowed her to move freely, gather intelligence, and coordinate with others, while the uncertainty of her movements amplified the psychological impact of her actions. Shadows became symbols, and silence carried meaning. Overseers attempted to track her, but every effort to impose order was thwarted by her careful planning and understanding of the terrain. Each failure to catch her reinforced her legend, adding layers to the whispers that now defined the cultural consciousness of the plantation. Her acts of subtle defiance were carefully timed to maximize impact. Deliberate mistakes, staged accidents, and minor disruptions were orchestrated to create frustration, doubt, and a sense of vulnerability among those tasked with maintaining order. By controlling the narrative through rumor, she ensured that her influence extended beyond physical acts, shaping the emotional and psychological landscape of the plantation. Masters and overseers were caught in a constant cycle of anticipation and uncertainty, their confidence eroding as her reputation grew. The intertwined relationship between action and rumor became central to her strategy. Each act, each subtle manipulation, each whispered account reinforced the other, creating a feedback loop that magnified her influence while minimizing risk. The enslaved learned from observation, the masters feared what they could not control, and she remained at the center of the psychological tension that defined the plantation. The power of perception had become as significant as the power of force, and she wielded it with precision. By the end of this period, her presence was felt everywhere, even when unseen. Rumors had taken on a life of their own, shaping behavior, influencing decisions, and inspiring courage. Shadows carried her influence, whispers carried her legend, and the plantation became a space where perception and subtle action held as much power as physical domination. Fear, admiration, and uncertainty coexisted, creating an atmosphere in which every movement was measured, every glance scrutinized, and every story told reinforced her growing legacy. The stage was set for the next phase of her defiance, one in which the psychological and the practical would intersect more dramatically than ever before. The tension on the plantation continued to mount as her influence grew. What had begun as small acts of subtle defiance had evolved into a complex network of psychological and practical resistance. The overseers, frustrated by repeated disruptions and the seeming invisibility of their adversary, began to tighten their control, increasing patrols, scrutinizing every movement, and interrogating the enslaved more frequently. Yet each attempt to assert authority only played into her hands, allowing her to anticipate reactions, manipulate attention, and continue her acts with even greater precision. The plantation, once predictable in its rhythms, had become a stage of suspense, uncertainty, and careful maneuvering. Her methods became increasingly sophisticated. Every movement, every task completed, was carefully observed, analyzed, and adjusted to maximize effect. A misaligned tool, a minor disruption in the fields, or a delayed task became part of a pattern that conveyed both presence and defiance. She understood the psychological impact of anticipation, of subtle disruption, and of the unknown. Overseers could not predict her actions, and masters could not fully comprehend the depth of her influence. This uncertainty created fear that permeated every level of the plantation hierarchy, destabilizing authority without open confrontation. Coordination among the enslaved had grown more structured under her guidance. Whispered instructions, coded gestures, and careful observation allowed multiple acts to unfold simultaneously across the estate without detection. Children, trained in observation and subtle communication, played a small but crucial role in relaying messages and signaling changes in routine. Adults, emboldened by her example, began to take calculated risks, further amplifying the ripple of defiance she had initiated. The plantation became a network of quiet resistance, a living system in which trust, timing, and awareness were as important as physical strength. She understood the importance of perception as much as action. The overseers and masters could not confront her directly because she remained elusive, her movements calculated and deliberate. Each act of sabotage or subtle disruption was paired with the strategic cultivation of rumor, ensuring that her influence extended far beyond her physical presence. The enslaved spoke of her daring in hushed tones, passing on lessons in discretion, observation, and timing. Even the smallest gestures, pausing at a corner, a deliberate glance, a carefully chosen word, carried meaning, reinforcing her authority and guiding the behavior of those around her. As the network of defiance expanded, so too did the psychological burden on the overseers. They were forced to question their competence, their observations, and even the loyalty of those they monitored. Fear became pervasive, an invisible force that influenced decision-making and eroded confidence. Each failed attempt to uncover the source of disruption added to their unease, creating an environment in which the smallest irregularity sparked suspicion and anxiety. Her ability to exploit this fear allowed her to maintain control without direct confrontation, turning psychological manipulation into a strategic weapon. Her audacity grew alongside her understanding of human behavior. She began orchestrating larger, more coordinated acts that required precise timing and careful execution. Livestock were subtly released to delay fieldwork, tools were deliberately misplaced to cause frustration, and minor accidents were staged to create confusion and uncertainty. Each act was designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing immediate risk. The overseers were caught in a web of unpredictability, their authority undermined not by open rebellion but by the steady accumulation of controlled disruption. She also became a teacher, instructing trusted individuals in the subtleties of observation, timing, and coordination. Through whispered lessons and carefully modeled actions, she cultivated a cadre of individuals capable of independent action that aligned with her overall strategy. The enslaved community began to internalize her methods, learning to interpret subtle cues, anticipate authority responses, and act with discretion. Her influence extended not only through direct intervention but through the empowerment of those around her, creating a multiplier effect that amplified both reach and impact. The physical environment played an increasingly central role in her strategy. She knew every hidden path, thicket, and vantage point on the plantation, using these features to evade detection and coordinate action. Nights were her ally, providing cover and amplifying the psychological effect of her movements. Shadows became instruments of influence, silence became a language, and the plantation itself became an extension of her strategic thinking. Each successful use of terrain reinforced her legend, further destabilizing authority and inspiring those she led. Masters began to realize that they were facing more than a series of minor disruptions, they were confronting a deliberate, intelligent, and strategic mind capable of manipulating both environment and perception. Their responses became increasingly desperate, relying on intimidation, punishment, and surveillance, yet each action further demonstrated the limits of their control. Her awareness of their psychology allowed her to anticipate moves, redirect suspicion, and continue her acts with minimal exposure. The balance of power, though still heavily weighted in favor of the masters, had begun to shift subtly in ways that could not be easily reversed. The growing complexity of her defiance created a tension that was palpable across the plantation. Overseers walked on edge, fearing missteps and overreactions, while the enslaved moved with a newfound confidence tempered by caution. Every interaction, from casual conversations to routine tasks, became a potential site of influence. Her presence, whether visible or unseen, reshaped the social dynamics of the estate, altering behavior, expectations, and the distribution of psychological power. Her legend continued to spread beyond the plantation itself. Neighboring estates heard fragmented accounts of her cunning, her intelligence, and her audacity. Some stories were embellished into near mythical tales, others focused on concrete disruptions and observable acts. This reputation created a broader psychological impact, influencing behavior and expectations in communities that had never directly encountered her. Fear and respect extended beyond the immediate boundaries of her environment, making her influence far-reaching and difficult to counter. Her mastery of timing became critical. Every action was executed with careful consideration of oversight patterns, environmental conditions, and human behavior. Minor acts were strategically staged to coincide with moments of vulnerability, creating maximum effect with minimal exposure. This precision reflected not only intelligence but a deep understanding of risk, consequence, and the interplay between perception and action. Her ability to orchestrate these events demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that far exceeded the ordinary scope of daily survival under slavery. By the end of this phase, the plantation had transformed into a landscape of tension, observation, and calculated disruption. Her influence was pervasive, extending through subtle acts, coordinated networks, and psychological manipulation. Fear, uncertainty, and admiration intertwined, creating an environment in which authority was constantly tested, and the enslaved community began to experience a measure of empowerment previously unimaginable. The gathering storm had solidified her position as a central force on the plantation, setting the stage for more daring interventions, escalations, and confrontations that would define the course of her rebellion. Her growing influence on the plantation reached a point where subtlety alone was no longer sufficient. The complexity of her defiance demanded strategy, coordination, and the careful orchestration of multiple actions simultaneously. She had long understood the power of observation, the importance of timing, and the leverage of perception. Now, she began to weave these elements into a comprehensive system, a web of secrecy in which each act, gesture, and message reinforced the others. The plantation, already tense with suspicion and unease, became a theater in which psychological manipulation, physical disruption, and communication networks intersected, creating a landscape in which she operated with both precision and authority. Every movement on the plantation was now calculated with intent. Tasks were performed not just to maintain daily survival but to send signals, to test reactions, and to establish patterns that could later be exploited. A tool left slightly out of place was not merely an inconvenience, it became evidence of oversight failure, a message to those watching that control was not absolute. Livestock wandering unexpectedly through the fields created temporary chaos, forcing overseers to respond and exposing the limits of their power. Each act was small on its own, but collectively they created an environment in which the ordinary rhythms of plantation life were subtly undermined, eroding confidence and creating psychological tension. Coordination became central to her strategy. She identified trusted individuals, teaching them the nuances of subtle resistance, the importance of timing, and the ways in which perception could be manipulated. Communication relied on carefully constructed codes. A glance, a touch, a particular arrangement of objects, all became instruments of coordination. These signals allowed multiple acts of defiance to unfold simultaneously, maintaining the illusion of spontaneity while actually being the product of careful planning. The enslaved community became an interconnected network, each person understanding their role and the consequences of their actions within the larger strategy. Her mastery of human psychology was evident in how she manipulated authority figures. Overseers, frustrated by repeated disruptions, increasingly doubted their own judgment and the loyalty of those under their supervision. Each failed attempt to control her actions or predict her next move reinforced their unease. Masters, too, found themselves facing uncertainty, questioning the reliability of reports and the integrity of systems they had long considered unassailable. By exploiting predictable patterns of fear, overconfidence, and rigid thinking, she turned the very structure of authority into a vulnerability, using it to amplify the impact of her defiance. The web extended beyond immediate actions to encompass rumor, observation, and environmental manipulation. Stories of her intelligence, audacity, and cunning traveled quietly, carried by those within the quarters and beyond the plantation. These accounts served a dual purpose, inspiring hope and courage among the enslaved while sowing fear and uncertainty among overseers and neighboring masters. The combination of tangible disruption and the perception of omnipresence created a psychological landscape in which authority was continually tested, and confidence in control eroded incrementally but inexorably. She understood that secrecy was essential for survival. Her actions required careful concealment, not just from those in authority but from any who might inadvertently compromise her strategy. Trust was calibrated precisely, only those proven reliable were included in coordination efforts, and even they were carefully guided in how much information to hold and how to act. This selective inclusion ensured operational security while allowing the network to function effectively. The web of secrets became a living system, constantly adapting to the movements of overseers, the demands of work, and the flow of information. Environmental awareness continued to play a central role. She used hidden paths, dense thickets, and vantage points to move unseen and to observe activity across the plantation. Nights provided cover and amplified the effects of her actions, while natural obstacles and predictable routines of oversight became tools she could exploit. The land itself became part of the network, a fallen tree that forced a patrol to detour, a stream that provided cover, a barn whose layout allowed subtle signaling. Her intimate knowledge of terrain multiplied the effectiveness of her strategies, giving her both mobility and influence that were invisible yet profoundly felt. Teaching others to interpret subtle cues became an essential component of her leadership. Through demonstration, storytelling, and careful guidance, she trained others to recognize signals, anticipate reactions, and act with discretion. Children, elders, and adults alike became nodes in her network, participating in acts of resistance that ranged from minor disruptions to coordinated events with lasting psychological impact. Each person's role reinforced the larger system, creating redundancy and resilience while ensuring that the influence of her web extended beyond her immediate presence. She also understood the importance of escalation and misdirection. Some acts were intentionally minor, designed to test reactions or distract attention, while others carried more substantial consequences, such as delaying harvests or complicating logistical work. By carefully calibrating the scale of each intervention, she controlled the narrative, maintained plausible deniability, and ensured that fear and uncertainty remained central tools in her strategy. Overseers and masters were caught in a constant cycle of anticipation, reaction, and re-evaluation, unable to predict her next move. The interplay between physical acts and psychological influence created a powerful dynamic. Disruptions were not simply inconveniences, they became lessons in awareness and anticipation, training those under her guidance to act effectively within the constraints imposed upon them. The enslaved community learned the subtleties of timing, observation, and coordination, while overseers faced the frustration of a system that appeared orderly yet was increasingly unpredictable. This dual effect reinforced her influence while minimizing personal risk, allowing her to operate strategically rather than recklessly. Her ability to maintain this system required vigilance, intelligence, and adaptability. Each success was carefully evaluated, each failure analyzed, and each new challenge incorporated into her understanding of the plantation's social and operational dynamics. The web of secrets was not static, it evolved with each day, responding to the movements of authority, the rhythms of work, and the psychology of participants. Flexibility and foresight were essential, and she demonstrated both in abundance, ensuring the continuity and resilience of her influence. By now, the plantation had transformed into a theater of subtle rebellion, psychological tension, and coordinated defiance. Her presence, whether visible or invisible, reshaped the daily life of everyone on the estate. Masters and overseers were forced to operate under a constant cloud of uncertainty, their authority tested not by open confrontation but by the steady accumulation of disruptions, rumors, and perception-based influence. The enslaved community, in turn, was increasingly empowered, capable of coordinated action that reinforced both survival and resistance. The web of secrets extended its influence even to those who were not directly involved in her network. Casual observers, market travelers, and neighboring estates became aware, through stories and rumors, that an individual existed who could manipulate perception, anticipate authority, and orchestrate coordinated acts of disruption with skill and precision. Fear of her capabilities grew, and her reputation spread beyond the immediate plantation, creating a broader psychological landscape in which her influence was both real and imagined. Through this network, she effectively controlled both action and perception. She could shape outcomes without appearing to act directly, manipulate authority without confrontation, and inspire others to participate in subtle resistance while maintaining the operational security of her system. The plantation became a microcosm of her strategic vision, a complex interplay of human behavior, environmental knowledge, and psychological manipulation, all orchestrated from a position of careful observation and disciplined intelligence. By the end of this phase, her web of secrets had transformed the plantation. Authority was undermined not through overt violence but through precision, strategy, and the careful cultivation of perception. Fear, admiration, and uncertainty coexisted, creating an atmosphere in which every glance, movement, and story carried weight. Her influence extended beyond herself, establishing a resilient network that operated quietly, effectively, and dangerously. The stage was now set for the next escalation, where the consequences of her strategy would reach deeper, and the tension between control and defiance would intensify in ways that could no longer be ignored. The carefully constructed patterns of defiance, observation, and subtle manipulation were reaching a critical juncture. The plantation, already rife with tension and unease, began to show the strain of prolonged psychological and practical disruption. Overseers, frustrated and anxious, intensified their efforts to regain control, yet each attempt seemed to deepen their vulnerability. Every misstep became a lesson in caution, every disruption, no matter how minor, was scrutinized for meaning. The enslaved community, guided by her example, had grown increasingly confident in their ability to act with subtlety and precision, creating a dynamic in which authority and resistance existed in a constant state of push and pull. She understood that the breaking point was approaching and that timing would determine its impact. Subtle acts of defiance were now joined by larger, more consequential interventions, each carefully calculated to maximize effect while minimizing exposure. Livestock were guided into hidden paths to delay work, tools were systematically misplaced, and tasks were intentionally mismanaged to create cascading disruptions. Each act was part of a broader strategy, aimed at destabilizing oversight, undermining confidence, and amplifying the psychological tension that had been cultivated over months of careful manipulation. Her awareness of human behavior allowed her to anticipate not just immediate reactions but long-term consequences. Overseers, exhausted and uncertain, became increasingly erratic in their decision-making. Their frustration manifested in heightened scrutiny, harsher punishments, and impulsive actions that often backfired, further demonstrating the effectiveness of her strategy. The enslaved observed, learned, and adapted, reinforcing her influence and the resilience of her network. The plantation had become a laboratory of human psychology, where fear, anticipation, and intelligence interacted in ways that constantly shifted the balance of power. Coordination among the enslaved reached a new level of sophistication. Previously isolated acts of subtle resistance were now synchronized across multiple locations, creating the illusion of omnipresence. Messages were relayed through whispered signals, gestures, and coded routines, allowing independent actors to participate in a shared strategy without exposing themselves to unnecessary risk. The result was a network that operated almost invisibly yet had tangible effects on the operation of the plantation. Each disruption, each calculated act, added to the mounting pressure on authority figures, creating conditions in which mistakes and misjudgments became inevitable. The psychological impact on overseers was profound. They questioned their perceptions, doubted their ability to maintain control, and feared consequences they could neither predict nor prevent. This pervasive uncertainty eroded confidence and created an environment in which small errors had amplified consequences. Every mismanaged task, every missing item, and every unexplained occurrence contributed to a sense of instability. Masters, too, began to feel the pressure, realizing that the network of subtle resistance extended beyond the immediate sight of the overseers and had become a persistent threat to order. Her strategic mind guided each escalation. She balanced the potential risk of discovery against the benefits of increased disruption, carefully selecting moments in which the psychological effect would be maximized. Small, controlled incidents were interspersed with larger, more impactful interventions, creating a rhythm of unpredictability that kept overseers off balance. The plantation, once predictable and orderly, now operated under a constant state of uncertainty, where anticipation and reaction replaced routine and obedience. She also began to exploit interpersonal dynamics among the overseers. Rivalries, frustrations, and insecurities were subtly manipulated to ensure that suspicion was misdirected and authority undermined from within. Overseers accused one another of negligence or incompetence, creating internal conflict that further destabilized the system. Her understanding of human psychology allowed her to use these tensions to her advantage, turning the very structure of enforcement into a tool for her strategy. The plantation became a web of influence, where perception, rumor, and carefully orchestrated action combined to erode control. The network of the enslaved responded with increased sophistication. Individuals learned to anticipate responses, coordinate actions, and exploit patterns without being detected. Children played a role in observation and message relay, adults executed coordinated disruptions, and elders provided guidance on discretion and timing. This collective intelligence amplified her influence exponentially, allowing the network to function with resilience even when she was not present. Her leadership had transformed isolated acts of defiance into a system of organized, strategic resistance. Environmental manipulation became a central component of this escalation. Hidden paths, vantage points, and natural obstacles were used to facilitate covert movements, signal messages, and amplify the psychological effect of her actions. Nights, shadows, and the natural landscape became extensions of her strategy, creating opportunities for action that were simultaneously concealed and impactful. The plantation itself had become a living instrument of disruption, shaped and reshaped by her understanding of space, concealment, and timing. Rumor and perception remained critical to her influence. Stories of her cleverness and daring, both accurate and exaggerated, circulated continuously, reinforcing her reputation and instilling fear in those tasked with maintaining order. These narratives complemented her physical actions, ensuring that her influence extended beyond direct observation. Masters and overseers were confronted with the dual reality of tangible disruption and the intangible threat of omnipresence, a combination that proved psychologically destabilizing. The escalation created moments of intense risk. Each larger intervention carried the potential for discovery and retaliation. Yet her careful planning, understanding of human behavior, and network of allies allowed her to minimize exposure. Every detail was considered: timing, location, environmental cover, and the likely reactions of those in authority. Her ability to orchestrate these actions with precision reflected both intelligence and courage, ensuring that the impact was maximized while personal danger was controlled. By this stage, the plantation was operating under a new paradigm. Authority was no longer absolute, it was constantly challenged, questioned, and manipulated. The enslaved, emboldened by her example and coordinated strategies, began to exercise agency in ways previously unimaginable. The overseers, in contrast, were caught in a cycle of anticipation, reaction, and uncertainty, unable to assert complete control despite their efforts. Fear, tension, and respect coexisted in a delicate balance, reshaping the social and operational dynamics of the estate. Her acts now carried symbolic as well as practical weight. Each disruption served to demonstrate intelligence, courage, and strategic foresight, inspiring her peers and reinforcing the network of resistance. The psychological effect on authority figures intensified, as they became aware not only of the tangible disruptions but of the broader pattern of calculated influence. The plantation had become a stage in which she directed both action and perception, a living demonstration of strategic defiance and psychological mastery. By the end of this period, the breaking point had been reached. The plantation was a space of heightened tension, unpredictability, and subtle rebellion. Authority was undermined not through open conflict but through disciplined, strategic, and coordinated acts of resistance. Masters and overseers were destabilized, the enslaved were empowered, and the network she had cultivated operated with resilience and precision. The environment was primed for the next phase, in which the consequences of her strategy would manifest more fully and the balance of power would be tested in ways that could no longer be contained. The carefully constructed patterns of defiance, observation, and subtle manipulation were reaching a critical juncture. The plantation, already rife with tension and unease, began to show the strain of prolonged psychological and practical disruption. Overseers, frustrated and anxious, intensified their efforts to regain control, yet each attempt seemed to deepen their vulnerability. Every misstep became a lesson in caution, every disruption, no matter how minor, was scrutinized for meaning. The enslaved community, guided by her example, had grown increasingly confident in their ability to act with subtlety and precision, creating a dynamic in which authority and resistance existed in a constant state of push and pull. She understood that the breaking point was approaching and that timing would determine its impact. Subtle acts of defiance were now joined by larger, more consequential interventions, each carefully calculated to maximize effect while minimizing exposure. Livestock were guided into hidden paths to delay work, tools were systematically misplaced, and tasks were intentionally mismanaged to create cascading disruptions. Each act was part of a broader strategy, aimed at destabilizing oversight, undermining confidence, and amplifying the psychological tension that had been cultivated over months of careful manipulation. Her awareness of human behavior allowed her to anticipate not just immediate reactions but long-term consequences. Overseers, exhausted and uncertain, became increasingly erratic in their decision-making. Their frustration manifested in heightened scrutiny, harsher punishments, and impulsive actions that often backfired, further demonstrating the effectiveness of her strategy. The enslaved observed, learned, and adapted, reinforcing her influence and the resilience of her network. The plantation had become a laboratory of human psychology, where fear, anticipation, and intelligence interacted in ways that constantly shifted the balance of power. Coordination among the enslaved reached a new level of sophistication. Previously isolated acts of subtle resistance were now synchronized across multiple locations, creating the illusion of omnipresence. Messages were relayed through whispered signals, gestures, and coded routines, allowing independent actors to participate in a shared strategy without exposing themselves to unnecessary risk. The result was a network that operated almost invisibly yet had tangible effects on the operation of the plantation. Each disruption, each calculated act, added to the mounting pressure on authority figures, creating conditions in which mistakes and misjudgments became inevitable. The psychological impact on overseers was profound. They questioned their perceptions, doubted their ability to maintain control, and feared consequences they could neither predict nor prevent. This pervasive uncertainty eroded confidence and created an environment in which small errors had amplified consequences. Every mismanaged task, every missing item, and every unexplained occurrence contributed to a sense of instability. Masters, too, began to feel the pressure, realizing that the network of subtle resistance extended beyond the immediate sight of the overseers and had become a persistent threat to order. Her strategic mind guided each escalation. She balanced the potential risk of discovery against the benefits of increased disruption, carefully selecting moments in which the psychological effect would be maximized. Small, controlled incidents were interspersed with larger, more impactful interventions, creating a rhythm of unpredictability that kept overseers off balance. The plantation, once predictable and orderly, now operated under a constant state of uncertainty, where anticipation and reaction replaced routine and obedience. She also began to exploit interpersonal dynamics among the overseers. Rivalries, frustrations, and insecurities were subtly manipulated to ensure that suspicion was misdirected and authority undermined from within. Overseers accused one another of negligence or incompetence, creating internal conflict that further destabilized the system. Her understanding of human psychology allowed her to use these tensions to her advantage, turning the very structure of enforcement into a tool for her strategy. The plantation became a web of influence, where perception, rumor, and carefully orchestrated action combined to erode control. The network of the enslaved responded with increased sophistication. Individuals learned to anticipate responses, coordinate actions, and exploit patterns without being detected. Children played a role in observation and message relay, adults executed coordinated disruptions, and elders provided guidance on discretion and timing. This collective intelligence amplified her influence exponentially, allowing the network to function with resilience even when she was not present. Her leadership had transformed isolated acts of defiance into a system of organized, strategic resistance. Environmental manipulation became a central component of this escalation. Hidden paths, vantage points, and natural obstacles were used to facilitate covert movements, signal messages, and amplify the psychological effect of her actions. Nights, shadows, and the natural landscape became extensions of her strategy, creating opportunities for action that were simultaneously concealed and impactful. The plantation itself had become a living instrument of disruption, shaped and reshaped by her understanding of space, concealment, and timing. Rumor and perception remained critical to her influence. Stories of her cleverness and daring, both accurate and exaggerated, circulated continuously, reinforcing her reputation and instilling fear in those tasked with maintaining order. These narratives complemented her physical actions, ensuring that her influence extended beyond direct observation. Masters and overseers were confronted with the dual reality of tangible disruption and the intangible threat of omnipresence, a combination that proved psychologically destabilizing. Her acts now carried symbolic as well as practical weight. Each disruption served to demonstrate intelligence, courage, and strategic foresight, inspiring her peers and reinforcing the network of resistance. The psychological effect on authority figures intensified, as they became aware not only of the tangible disruptions but of the broader pattern of calculated influence. The plantation had become a stage in which she directed both action and perception, a living demonstration of strategic defiance and psychological mastery. The pressure on the overseers reached its peak. They were forced into continuous vigilance, their routines disrupted, their confidence undermined, and their decision-making clouded by fear and uncertainty. Every minor incident demanded over-analysis, every rumor required scrutiny, and every misstep seemed magnified in its consequences. The cumulative effect was the weakening of authority from within, orchestrated not by overt rebellion but by the steady, deliberate application of strategy, observation, and human understanding. Her network of allies had grown resilient and adaptive. Individuals who had previously acted only under direct guidance now understood the principles she had taught: observation, timing, coordination, and discretion. This autonomy increased the effectiveness of the network while decreasing personal exposure, allowing acts of resistance to multiply in reach and impact. The plantation had transformed into a living system of subtle defiance, operating both with and without her immediate presence. By the end of this phase, the breaking point had been reached. The plantation was a space of heightened tension, unpredictability, and subtle rebellion. Authority was undermined not through open conflict but through disciplined, strategic, and coordinated acts of resistance. Masters and overseers were destabilized, the enslaved were empowered, and the network she had cultivated operated with resilience and precision. The environment was primed for the next phase, in which the consequences of her strategy would manifest more fully and the balance of power would be tested in ways that could no longer be contained. The days following the culmination of her most daring acts were filled with a tension that seemed almost tangible, a heavy, unspoken weight that pressed on every individual on the plantation. The overseers, worn down by repeated failures to anticipate or prevent disruption, moved with a combination of anxiety and suspicion. Every glance, every misplaced object, and every whisper carried potential meaning, and their minds, previously confident in routines and hierarchies, now spun in endless cycles of doubt. Masters felt the subtle erosion of control, aware that the invisible threads of influence extended beyond their immediate line of sight. The plantation, once a space of predictable order, had become a theater of lingering unease, where uncertainty dictated behavior as much as fear. Her influence, though invisible in direct observation, was palpable across the estate. The enslaved community, empowered by the success of coordinated acts and subtle manipulation, moved with a confidence that had been cultivated over months of careful planning. They understood the value of timing, discretion, and observation. Every action, whether gathering provisions, tending fields, or performing household tasks, was now infused with an awareness of the broader network of resistance. Small gestures, seemingly insignificant, were recognized as part of a larger system of strategy and communication, reinforcing the legacy of her defiance. The overseers' frustration became increasingly personal. Their authority, once absolute, was questioned not only by the tangible disruptions but also by the perception of her omnipresence. Rumors of her intelligence and audacity spread quietly through quarters and neighboring plantations, exaggerating her abilities and instilling a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Every mismanaged tool, every delayed task, and every whispered story became evidence of an adversary who could not be easily confronted. This perception of omnipotence amplified fear, creating a psychological landscape in which even minor anomalies were interpreted as deliberate acts of defiance. She had become a symbol as much as a strategist. The stories of her cunning and bravery traveled through the quarters, passed in whispers and subtle nods, carrying lessons for those who observed and participated. Children learned to recognize coded signals, elders interpreted patterns with seasoned wisdom, and adults executed coordinated acts with precision. The plantation itself became a living classroom in which resilience, intelligence, and subtlety were taught not through formal instruction but through observation and example. Her influence extended beyond individual acts, shaping behavior, inspiring courage, and reinforcing a shared sense of agency. The subtle erosion of control was felt in every corner of the estate. Overseers, increasingly aware of their limitations, attempted to impose stricter oversight, yet each effort revealed vulnerabilities that had previously gone unnoticed. Their decisions became reactive rather than proactive, and the cycle of miscalculation reinforced the effectiveness of the resistance network. The enslaved, attuned to the rhythms of observation and response, were able to navigate these challenges with skill, using discretion and coordination to continue asserting agency within a constrained system. Environmental mastery continued to play a crucial role. She had long understood the advantages provided by terrain, cover, and natural observation points. Hidden paths allowed movement without detection, shadowed areas facilitated clandestine meetings, and familiar knowledge of the estate's geography provided strategic advantages that outsiders could not anticipate. These environmental strategies enhanced both physical and psychological influence, creating conditions in which her presence, though often unseen, was profoundly felt across the plantation. The aftermath was not only about disruption but also about empowerment. The enslaved had internalized her methods of subtle defiance, developing skills in observation, anticipation, and discreet coordination. Confidence grew alongside caution, as individuals realized the effectiveness of measured resistance. This empowerment was a quiet revolution, one that challenged the authority structure without open confrontation. Each act of strategic compliance, subtle sabotage, or coordinated communication became a testament to the resilience and intelligence cultivated under her leadership. Masters and overseers, in contrast, were confronted with the limitations of their power. Their perception of omnipotence had been eroded, replaced by awareness of a sophisticated system that could not be easily controlled. The combination of tangible disruptions and the spread of reputation created a dual reality that was psychologically destabilizing. Authority was undermined not through a single dramatic event but through the accumulation of subtle interventions, perception management, and strategic influence. The plantation had become a space where power was contested in unseen ways, and the balance had shifted, if only incrementally. Rumors and stories played an equally critical role in this phase. Tales of her cleverness, audacity, and near invisibility circulated quietly, ensuring that her influence extended beyond direct observation. Neighboring plantations and visitors began to hear fragments of these accounts, creating a broader psychological impact. Fear of her capabilities was amplified, and the awareness of a figure capable of orchestrating precise, coordinated defiance spread, reinforcing the sense that her reach extended beyond the immediate plantation. The perception of omnipotence, whether fully accurate or partially imagined, became a central element of her enduring influence. The enslaved community internalized the lessons of this period in ways that were both practical and symbolic. Observation, timing, and coordination became second nature. Acts of resistance, small or large, were undertaken with careful consideration of consequences and potential outcomes. The network of subtle defiance functioned as a living system, capable of adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining operational security. Her influence had transformed individual behaviors, collective strategies, and social dynamics across the estate. By the end of this period, the aftermath of defiance had established a new equilibrium. Authority, though still present, was continuously challenged. Fear, uncertainty, and respect coexisted in a delicate balance. The enslaved were empowered, equipped with knowledge, strategy, and courage, while overseers and masters were left to navigate a complex environment where control was increasingly tenuous. Her acts had created not only immediate disruption but also a lasting legacy of resilience, strategic thinking, and psychological mastery that would influence the plantation long after any single intervention. The plantation had changed in ways that could not be reversed. Her influence lingered in every corner, shaping perception and behavior even without her visible presence. Overseers moved cautiously, their authority challenged by the memory of disruptions they could neither prevent nor predict. Masters attempted to reassert control through stricter oversight, yet each effort highlighted the fragility of their power. Every shadow, every glance, every slight irregularity reminded them that the balance had shifted, and that control was never absolute. The enslaved carried with them the lessons she had instilled. Observation, timing, and subtle communication had become second nature. Each gesture, each movement, each minor act of disruption was part of a broader, coordinated system. The plantation operated according to dual realities, the visible routines enforced by authority and the invisible network of subtle defiance, which quietly shaped daily life. Her presence was reinforced by reputation and rumor. Stories of her intelligence and audacity spread across the quarters and neighboring estates, amplifying fear and respect. Even without direct action, her influence was felt, guiding the enslaved in coordinated acts of resilience and quiet resistance. Environmental knowledge, hidden paths, and the manipulation of shadows allowed her lessons to endure, turning the land itself into an instrument of subtle power. Authority, confronted with these limitations, became reactive and uncertain. Overseers and masters were constantly anticipating disruptions, analyzing minor anomalies for hidden meaning, yet their efforts often played into the patterns she had established. The plantation had become a space where perception, strategy, and psychological influence dominated, a living testament to her enduring mastery. Even after the immediate confrontations and disruptions had subsided, her presence remained a persistent and almost spectral force across the plantation. The enslaved carried with them the knowledge she had instilled, a careful understanding of timing, observation, and subtle resistance that had become second nature. These lessons were no longer just tools of survival, they had become a language of agency, communication, and strategy. Every glance, gesture, and arrangement of tools could convey meaning, a silent dialogue within a network that extended far beyond her visible actions. The plantation operated according to two overlapping realities, the apparent routine dictated by overseers and masters, and the underlying, organized system of resistance she had cultivated, a reality that continued to shape behavior even in her absence. The psychological effects on authority figures persisted long after the peak of her active defiance. Overseers, constantly on edge, scrutinized every anomaly, aware that small mistakes could carry amplified consequences. Their confidence, once unshakable, had been eroded by repeated failures to anticipate her actions. Masters, too, were forced to acknowledge that control was not absolute, that perception could be manipulated, and that strategic intelligence could exist within those they sought to dominate. This lingering uncertainty created a perpetual tension, a shadow under which authority operated in a state of subtle but continuous erosion. Her influence continued to manifest in practical ways. The enslaved executed tasks with strategic precision, balancing compliance with calculated acts of subtle defiance. Livestock were managed to create delays or opportunities, tools were intentionally misplaced or organized in ways that conveyed messages, and daily routines were orchestrated to maximize efficiency for the enslaved while subtly undermining oversight. The plantation had become a living system in which every action was measured, observed, and potentially leveraged. Her guidance had instilled a culture of strategic thought that extended beyond her immediate presence, ensuring that her network of influence remained active and resilient. Rumors and stories of her audacity traveled even further, reaching neighboring estates and local communities. Some tales were grounded in observable fact, while others were embellished, creating a reputation that bordered on legendary. The mixture of truth and exaggeration amplified fear and respect, creating a psychological effect that extended beyond the plantation itself. Authority figures and local observers could not distinguish between myth and reality, and this ambiguity worked in her favor, reinforcing the perception of omnipresence and strategic mastery. Her reputation became a tool, a weapon of influence as potent as any direct act of defiance. The lessons she imparted were internalized by multiple generations within the enslaved community. Children learned the nuances of coded communication, adults practiced discretion and strategic intervention, and elders offered guidance rooted in experience and observation. Her methods had become embedded in the culture of the plantation, a set of principles that governed behavior, shaped decision-making, and allowed for collective agency. The enslaved were no longer mere participants in isolated acts of resistance, they were practitioners of a sophisticated, organized system that balanced risk, opportunity, and consequence. Her mastery of environmental knowledge continued to be a critical factor. Hidden paths, vantage points, and natural obstacles remained tools for movement, observation, and coordination. Shadows, dense foliage, and architectural features were leveraged to maintain operational security while amplifying psychological impact. Even when she was not physically present, the landscape itself acted as an extension of her strategic vision, reinforcing both the practical and symbolic aspects of her influence. The plantation became a terrain of awareness, a space in which knowledge of place, timing, and perception guided behavior and shaped outcomes. The enduring enigma of her actions created a culture of subtle vigilance among overseers and masters. They were compelled to anticipate disruptions that might never occur, to analyze patterns that were intentionally misleading, and to operate under the constant possibility of being outmaneuvered. Every minor deviation from routine was scrutinized, and every interaction carried the potential for hidden meaning. This perpetual state of psychological pressure ensured that authority remained cautious, reactive, and, at times, ineffective. The power she had exerted through strategy and perception continued to shape the dynamics of control long after any single event. Her symbolic influence grew alongside the practical. Tales of her cunning and intelligence inspired not only immediate allies but also successive generations within the enslaved community. These stories served as both warning and lesson, illustrating the possibilities of strategic resistance within a constrained system. Through narrative, observation, and example, she maintained her presence as a guiding force, shaping behavior and expectation even among those who had never witnessed her actions directly. Her influence was no longer limited to individual acts, it had become a framework of thought, a philosophy of agency and subtle power. The plantation itself had transformed into a space defined by duality, overt compliance intertwined with covert strategy. Daily life was orchestrated according to patterns of observation, anticipation, and coordinated subtle defiance. Tasks that appeared routine were executed with awareness of the broader system she had established. Communication, whether verbal, gestural, or symbolic, operated within an underlying network of coordination that sustained her influence. This dual structure of apparent obedience and hidden agency created resilience, adaptability, and continuity, ensuring that her legacy endured beyond immediate events. Even as years passed, the psychological and practical effects of her presence persisted. Authority figures operated under the shadow of uncertainty, while the enslaved continued to exercise agency within the structured systems she had established. Her methods of observation, timing, coordination, and subtle manipulation had become embedded in daily life, shaping the interactions, decisions, and strategies of all who lived on the plantation. The enduring enigma of her influence remained a force that defined the balance of power, ensuring that her impact was neither fleeting nor easily erased. The legacy she had cultivated extended beyond the immediate physical environment. Neighboring estates, travelers, and local communities carried stories of her audacity, intelligence, and near-mythical skill. This broader awareness created a network of psychological influence that complemented the practical systems she had established on the plantation. Her presence, though often unseen, shaped perception and expectation across a wider region, amplifying the reach and resilience of her strategic vision. Fear, respect, and caution became intertwined in the consciousness of all who encountered or heard of her influence. By the end of this period, the enduring enigma had fully established her lasting presence. The plantation, the enslaved community, and even neighboring observers operated under the dual influence of practical coordination and psychological perception. Authority was continuously challenged, subtly undermined, and shaped by her strategic intelligence. The network of influence she had created persisted in both tangible and symbolic forms, ensuring that her legacy of defiance, resilience, and strategic mastery remained a defining feature of the plantation long after the height of her actions. Her presence was a force that could not be ignored, an enduring enigma whose shadow stretched far beyond the events that had made her known.